Hello and welcome to the viewers of this video. This is the Orange Fan here, bringing you another entry for the episode Recap and Thoughts category. This video will be dedicated to the B segment of episode 66 of The Loud House, Crimes of Fashion. We begin this segment with panels from an issue of the Ace Savvy comics being shown on screen. We quickly find out that Lincoln and Clyde are reading this issue of the Ace Savvy comics in the living room of the Loud House. Lincoln is wearing his Ace Savvy costume, and Clyde is wearing his One-Eyed Jack costume. Lincoln and Clyde both suspect that Card Shark is the villain responsible for the conflict of this issue, and when they turn the page, they find out that, yes, Card Shark is the villain responsible for the conflict of this issue. Lincoln and Clyde pat themselves on the back because this is the 5th consecutive time that they accurately guessed who the culprit was for a conflict from an issue of the Ace Savvy comics. Suddenly, Leni enters the Loud House, but she looks to be in despair. Lincoln and Clyde inquire Leni about what it is that's troubling her, so Leni begins to tell Lincoln and Clyde that it happened earlier this afternoon. So we see a flashback that shows us earlier in the afternoon. In this flashback, Leni is helping Girl Jordan and another customer at the clothing store that she started to work at in the segment Shop Girl. After Leni helps Girl Jordan and this other customer out, Mrs. Carmichael approaches Leni and clears her throat to get Leni's attention. Leni inquires Mrs. Carmichael about how the monthly inventory is going, and Mrs. Carmichael responds that it's not going very well because some scarves have gone missing. Mrs. Carmichael then requests that Leni come with her, and this leads to Leni suspecting that Mrs. Carmichael and her are going to go on a scavenger hunt. The flashback then ends, and in the present time, Leni mentions to Lincoln and Clyde that she quickly found out that there wasn't going to be a scavenger hunt, and Mrs. Carmichael suspects that Leni was the one who stole the scarves. Lincoln and Clyde don't understand why Mrs. Carmichael would come to that conclusion. Leni mentions that the scarves came from Leni's department, and the scarves started to go missing during the time frame when Leni worked at the clothing store, which has been a month at this point in time. So those details are the reason why Mrs. Carmichael suspects that Leni was the one who stole the scarves, and Mrs. Carmichael fired Leni because of those details. So after Leni explains this to Lincoln and Clyde, Leni begins to cry and she rushes upstairs. Lincoln and Clyde both agree that it isn't fair that Leni was accused of stealing scarves. They bring up that Leni has a track record of not stealing things. Clyde thinks it would be nice if someone were to clear Leni's name, and this gives Lincoln an idea. Lincoln suggests that he and Clyde be the ones to clear Leni's name. Clyde, though, wonders what kids like them can do to help Leni out. Lincoln mentions how they were able to accurately guess who the culprits were for 5 different issues of the Ace Savvy comics, and this leads to Lincoln being confident that he and Clyde can figure out who the culprit is for these missing scarves. And Lincoln's speech does motivate Clyde into agreeing to try and help clear Leni's name. So the next scene takes us to the mall, and we see that Lincoln and Clyde have arrived at the clothing store, and they've split up to cover more ground. They're communicating with each other using walkie-talkies to make sure that they can stay alert in case they see anyone who could potentially be the culprit. So while Lincoln is investigating one part of the clothing store, someone grabs his cape, and Lincoln finds out that the one who grabbed his cape is a boy who's younger than him, Lincoln. And the boy has red hair and he has rather big eyebrows. The boy thinks that Lincoln's Ace Savvy costume is really cool, and the boy mentions that he's also playing superheroes right now. He actually inquires if Lincoln would be interested in seeing his superhero hideout. Lincoln, though, politely says that he's in the middle of an investigation, and then Lincoln inquires where this boy's parents are. The boy then points yes, the boy then points to who his mom is, and we find out that the boy's mom is Mrs. Carmichael. The boy sadly comments that his mom is too busy to play with him, too. And after that happens, Clyde contacts Lincoln over the walkie-talkie. Clyde says that he's found the scarves. Clyde has found the area where the scarves are for sale, and he's found who he thinks might be the suspect. So Lincoln apologizes to Mrs. Carmichael's son, saying that he needs to follow up with this lead that Clyde has found. So Lincoln meets up with Clyde, and Lincoln and Clyde see that the person near the scarves right now is actually one of their classmates from Royal Woods Elementary School. This classmate is a girl by the name of Gabby, and Gabby does look rather suspicious when she grabs one of the scarves, and Gabby looks rather suspicious when she takes one of the scarves and tries to walk away. So Lincoln and Clyde try to follow Gabby without her knowing that they're following her. And Gabby continues to act a bit suspicious. She comments about how she knows that she'll get in trouble, but thinks that this action will be well worth it. So eventually, Lincoln and Clyde Lincoln and Clyde decide to make their presence known and tell Gabby to stop. But Gabby doesn't notice them because someone else tells Gabby to stop. This someone else is Gabby's mom. And Gabby's mom says that Gabby can't have the scarf because Gabby has a lot of scarves. Gabby's mom comments that Gabby has a lot of scarves at home, and Gabby's mom doesn't want Gabby to have yet another scarf to add to the collection. Gabby, though, pleads with her mom to make an exception. She comments about how she has a gift card and she wanted to use this gift card for this scarf. Gabby's mom, though, responds that Gabby's aunt was the one who gave Gabby that gift card, and Gabby's aunt gave the gift card to Gabby for some shoes. So Gabby's mom instructs Gabby to return the scarf, and Gabby is disappointed but agrees to follow her mom's instructions. Gabby then sees Lincoln and Clyde and inquires what they're doing here. Lincoln and Clyde try to, not wanting Gabby to find out that they suspected her to be the culprit for stealing the scarves, Lincoln and Clyde just claim that they were shopping around the store. And Gabby points out the article of clothing that they were nearby, and this causes Lincoln and Clyde to be startled, and they knock over the articles of clothing. And one of the employees of the clothing store appears. Her name is later on revealed in the segment to be Fiona, and Fiona is rather frustrated, saying that it takes a while to put these articles of clothing back on the hangers. Lincoln and Clyde offer to clean up to appease Fiona, and they do also apologize to Fiona for causing a mess. And Lincoln and Clyde do try to clean up, but it doesn't go very well, to say the least. So the next scene happens at a later point in time, and Lincoln and Clyde both agree that they need to be more careful about who they think could be a suspect. So they want to make sure that the next person that they think could be a suspect needs to be really suspicious. Or yes, they think they shouldn't expect someone to be a suspect unless they act rather suspicious. And Lincoln and Clyde do see someone who they think is acting rather suspicious right now. This someone is Scoots. And Lincoln brings up the time when Scoots was in mall jail from the Season 1 segment for Bros About to Rock. Lincoln and Clyde then notice that Scoots has taken one of the scarves, and she goes into the fitting room. And Lincoln and Clyde suspect that Scoots might be trying to hide the scarf in her purse or her bag so that she can sneak out of the store without having to pay for the scarf. So Lincoln and Clyde then decide to come up with a plan in order to stop Scoots from escaping from the clothing store. So they see some hangers nearby. So they set the hangers down to act like act like a spike trap. Yes, it's kind of like a spike strip trap. That's essentially what they're using the hangers for. So Lincoln and Clyde have set this up just outside of the, or just before the entrance to the clothing store. Yes, they set up these hangers just in front of the doorway from the clothing store to the rest of the mall, and they figure they just need to wait for Scoots to try and escape. But then Lincoln and Clyde, yes, Lincoln and Clyde then see Scoots is rushing to leave the clothing store, but she's wearing the scarf. She's wearing the scarf like a toga. Scoots comments about how she needs to get to a toga party very quickly, and Scoots does have money. She does intend to pay for the scarf, and she actually does. She actually throws the money on the checkout desk, and Scoots has the money. She throws the money onto the checkout desk, and then she's rushing to leave to make it to this toga party. Lincoln and Clyde realize that they jump to conclusions about Scoots being the culprit, and they try to stop Scoots so that she won't, so that her scooter won't get caught in the hanger trap. But it doesn't work. Despite Lincoln and Clyde trying to warn Scoots, the tires on Scoots' scooter do pop on the hangers, and Scoots loses control of the scooter, and this knocks over some perfume. A display counter with some perfume is knocked over, and the perfume spills all over the floor. And then Scoots eventually skids out of the clothing store. Fiona then appears, and Fiona then sees the mess that was caused, and she's very furious, especially when she sees that Lincoln and Clyde played a role in this mess. Lincoln and Clyde do apologize to Fiona, and they offer to clean it up to appease Fiona. But Lincoln and Clyde's attempts to clean up this mess end up creating an even bigger mess, and Fiona demands that Lincoln and Clyde leave the clothing store. So later on, we see that Lincoln and Clyde are at the food court of the mall, and they're having a snack while they try to think over how they're going to approach solving this case now after the mistakes that have happened before. Lincoln and Clyde try to assure themselves that Ace Savvy and One-Eyed Jack have had their times of making mistakes when they tried to solve cases. And Lincoln and Clyde do make a point to remind each other that they need to be very careful and not be too quick to rush to conclusions. Clyde then notices someone acting rather suspicious leaving the clothing store, and Lincoln and Clyde do decide that this warrants looking into. So Lincoln and Clyde see that Fiona is the one leaving the clothing store in a rather suspicious manner. She's holding Fiona has a bag with her, and there's a piece of a blue fabric sticking out of this bag. The scarves are all blue, by the way. So yes, this leads to Lincoln and Clyde thinking that maybe Fiona is the culprit. They figure that Fiona wanting Lincoln and Clyde to leave Lincoln and Clyde suspect that Fiona wanted Lincoln and Clyde to leave so that they wouldn't figure out that she was the culprit, or to throw Lincoln and Clyde off her trail. That's what Lincoln and Clyde think. So Lincoln and Clyde think that they need to stop Fiona. Clyde insists that they chase after Fiona, but Lincoln says that they need to get someone else to join them. So Lincoln and Clyde re-enter the clothing store, and they're trying to find Mrs. Carmichael. But then Mrs. Carmichael's son actually appears from a clothing display. Mrs. Carmichael's son is excited to see Lincoln and Clyde have returned to the clothing store, and Mrs. Carmichael's son inquires if they can play superheroes. Lincoln politely apologizes to Mrs. Carmichael's son, saying that they're about to solve a case right now. Mrs. Carmichael's son is sad to hear this, and he returns inside of the clothing display that he popped out of not too long ago. So Lincoln and Clyde do find Mrs. Carmichael, and they do get her attention. Mrs. yes, they tell Mrs. Carmichael that that they have proof that Leni wasn't the one who stole the scarves. Mrs. Carmichael, though, doesn't know Lincoln or Clyde, or yes, she doesn't know who Lincoln and Clyde are, and she's confused about them wearing the superhero costumes. But Lincoln and Clyde insist that they're detectives, and they need Mrs. Carmichael to come with them because they think they've figured out who the real culprit is for the missing scarves. Mrs. Carmichael still doesn't really seem to buy into what Lincoln and Clyde say, but she decides to go ahead and follow them anyway. So eventually we see Fiona is, Fiona has put the bag in the trunk of her car and in the parking lot. Yes, Fiona's in the parking lot. She put the bag in the trunk of her car and she's about to drive off. But then Lincoln and Clyde catch up. Lincoln and Clyde and Mrs. Carmichael, although at this point in time, Fiona only sees Lincoln and Clyde. So Lincoln and Clyde make their presence known to Fiona, and they request that Fiona open up the trunk. And Fiona refuses to do so, but when Mrs. Carmichael makes her presence known and advises Fiona to open the trunk, Fiona agrees to do so, and Fiona admits that she was caught. But when Fiona opens the trunk and opens up the bag, Lincoln and Clyde are surprised to find out that this blue fabric isn't from one of the scarves. The blue fabric is actually from a dress. And Fiona then reveals that the reason why she acted so suspicious was because she actually bought this dress from a competing clothing store after her work hours were done. Fiona apologizes to Mrs. Carmichael and admits that she knows that it's a rule that employees aren't supposed to shop at competing clothing stores, but she admits that she couldn't resist because it was such a good deal, in her words. Mrs. Carmichael begins to scold Fiona, but then when Mrs. Carmichael notices the price tag of the dress, Mrs. Carmichael actually admits that this isn't a bad price at all, and Mrs. Carmichael even inquires Fiona about if this other clothing store has this dress in a 12. That's what Mrs. Carmichael inquires Fiona about. So Fiona then gets in her car, and then she proceeds to drive off. Lincoln and Clyde, she hasn't driven off just yet. Fiona is about to leave, and Lincoln and Clyde do apologize to Fiona for jumping to conclusions about her being the culprit. Fiona, though, acts rather apathetic towards their apology, and then she drives off. Lincoln and Clyde do acknowledge to Mrs. Carmichael that they have made some mistakes about who the culprit is, but they're determined to find out who the culprit is for these missing scarves. And Clyde even wonders if Mrs. Carmichael would be willing to help them out with certain details to help them find out who the culprit really is. Mrs. Carmichael, though, responds by saying she does appreciate that they are looking out for Leni and that they're trying to help Leni out. But Mrs. Carmichael also mentions that they're causing trouble at the clothing store, and Mrs. Carmichael says that she can't have these two kids in superhero costumes cause trouble at the clothing store. So Mrs. Carmichael, in a polite but stern manner, requests that Lincoln and Clyde not enter the clothing store again. Mrs. Carmichael then returns to the clothing store, while Lincoln tries to plead with Mrs. Carmichael to give them another chance to clear Leni's name, but Mrs. Carmichael doesn't hear them out. So later on, Lincoln and Clyde are back at the Loud House, and Lincoln and Clyde are in despair that they weren't able to help clear Leni's name. And Lincoln and Clyde are starting to think that Mrs. Carmichael has a point, that they're just kids in superhero costumes, and that they wouldn't really know how to solve the case. Or they comment about, Lincoln and Clyde comment along the lines about how Mrs. Carmichael might have a point, that they're just kids in superhero costumes causing trouble at at her clothing store, even if they have good intentions. And Clyde figures that reading comic books doesn't make them expert detectives. So Lincoln takes off his cape, while they're in despair, Lincoln takes off his cape, and Clyde tries to take off the fake mustache that he's wearing. Leni then comes downstairs, and she notices that Lincoln has taken off the cape, and she inquires Lincoln about if she can fold the cape. Leni is looking for articles of clothing to fold, and Lincoln says that Lincoln says he doesn't have a problem with Leni folding the cape, and actually says that Leni can have the cape. He thinks that he's not going to wear the cape anymore. Leni, though, then comments that the cape doesn't necessarily have to be a cape. She says that the cape could be a scarf, and this leads to Lincoln having a realization. Lincoln brings up to Clyde and Leni that if a cape can be a scarf, then the opposite can hold true. A scarf can be a cape. Lincoln then says he thinks he knows who the culprit is, and he urges, and then Clyde says that he agrees with Lincoln's hunch, although we, the viewers, don't get to hear Lincoln and Clyde's hunch just yet. So Lincoln requests that he has his cape back. Yes, Lincoln requests to Leni that he have his cape back because he's about to solve this case. And so Lincoln and Clyde, Lincoln and Clyde are preparing to head off, and yes, they're planning to head back to the mall. Oh, and Clyde makes sure to get his fake mustache back after he took it off. So Lincoln and Clyde have returned to the mall, and they've re-entered the clothing store. Lincoln and Clyde are planning to split up to cover more ground to see if they can find who they think the culprit is. But Mrs. Carmichael sees Lincoln and Clyde, and she clears her throat to get their attention. Mrs. Carmichael reminds Lincoln and Clyde that she had requested that they stay out of the clothing store. But Lincoln and Clyde assure Mrs. Carmichael that they don't plan to stay in the clothing store for very long. They just want to talk to her son. And Mrs. Carmichael is surprised to hear that they want to find her son. Suddenly, Mrs. Carmichael's son rushes up to Lincoln and Clyde. He's excited to see that Lincoln and Clyde have returned. And Lincoln then inquires Mrs. Carmichael's son if he would still be interested in playing superheroes with them. And Mrs. Carmichael's son assures Lincoln and Clyde that he's more than happy to play superheroes with them. And he urges Lincoln and Clyde to follow him to his superhero hideout. And Mrs. Carmichael is surprised to hear that her son has a superhero hideout. Lincoln and Clyde then encourage Mrs. Carmichael to come with them, saying that if she does so, it would prove to be, Lincoln and Clyde say that it would be in Mrs. Carmichael's best interest to join them in going to her son's superhero hideout. Mrs. Carmichael begrudgingly agrees to do so, but warns Lincoln and Clyde that if they're wrong about this, then she will see to it that they are banned from the mall until they are 18 years old. And Lincoln and Clyde begin to panic because this means they won't be able to go to the comic book store in the mall, they won't be able to get froyo in the mall either. Clyde comments to Lincoln that they better hope that their hunch is accurate this time around. So Mrs. Carmichael's son leads Mrs. Carmichael, Clyde, and Lincoln to a employees only room. Or yes, there's a doorway that says employees only, and there's some clothes in front of it. Or yes, there's a hanger full of clothes in front of this doorway. And Mrs. Carmichael's son puts on a show. He's pretending that he has to input a password in order to open up the superhero hideout. And after he pretends to input the password and goes through the clothes that are hanging on this hanger and through the doorway, Lincoln, Clyde, and Mrs. Carmichael follow Mrs. Carmichael's son. And they do see that this room is a storage room, and within the storage room, Mrs. Carmichael does see that that there are some mannequins, and on these mannequins are the missing scarves. Although Mrs. Carmichael's son insists that they're superhero capes, Mrs. Carmichael admits that she had made a mistake to suspect Leni to be the culprit, and she also thanks Lincoln and Clyde for helping her discover the truth about the missing scarves. Lincoln and Clyde do reply that that it was their pleasure to help solve this case. So the next scene takes place at a later point in time. Leni is once again working at the clothing store, and Leni is helping a customer. Leni is helping a customer at this clothing store. And after Leni helps the customer, Mrs. Carmichael approaches Leni, and Mrs. Carmichael is continuing to apologize to Leni for accusing Leni of being the one to steal the scarves. And Mrs. Carmichael wonders if there's any way she can make amends for making that accusation towards Leni. Leni wonders if there are any sweaters that she can fold, and Mrs. Carmichael gives a smile, indicating that, there are probably some sweaters that Leni can fold. Lincoln and Clyde then enter the clothing store, and Leni goes to greet Lincoln and Clyde. Leni thanks Lincoln and Clyde for clearing her name and allowing her to, Leni thanks Lincoln and Clyde for clearing her name because that allowed Leni to get her job at the clothing store back. And Leni has apparently been telling various individuals at the mall about how Lincoln and Clyde were the detectives that solved the case to clear Leni's name. And Lincoln and Clyde do reveal that, yes, they were made aware of this. Lincoln and Clyde were commenting about how some owners or employees from the pet store. Yes, Lincoln and Clyde bring up how they were aware of this because employees at the pet store were requesting Lincoln and Clyde's help finding a missing chameleon. Although Clyde also acknowledges that it's possible that the chameleon might not actually be missing, but just hidden because of the camouflage ability. And Leni responds that that's good to hear. Leni does mention that she's been telling these other people at the mall about Lincoln and Clyde because she says that Lincoln and Clyde are the detectives that they can count on to solve the case, although she gets the Ace Savvy and One-Eyed Jack names wrong. Lincoln and Clyde, though, Lincoln and Clyde don't mind that Leni got their superhero names wrong. They decide that the names were close enough. That's what they say. And Lincoln and Clyde do also comment about how they're ready to solve these other cases. But when Lincoln and Clyde do go off to solve these other cases, they accidentally knock down a sunglasses display or a sunglasses stand. Yeah, a stand or a display for sunglasses get knocked over by Lincoln and Clyde by accident. And Fiona sees Lincoln and Clyde were the ones that accidentally knocked over the display of sunglasses, and Fiona is rather angry with them. And that is how we end this segment. So this segment is another example of Season 3 having more serialized elements when compared to the first two seasons of The Loud House. This Season 3 segment is a follow-up to an earlier Season 3 this segment is a follow-up to an earlier Season 3 segment, that earlier Season 3 segment being Shop Girl, because Shop Girl was the segment when Leni started to work at this clothing store in the mall. And this segment continues to show Leni working at that clothing store until she was fired because she was suspected of stealing some scarves. But Lincoln and Clyde were able to clear Leni's name by the end of the segment, and Leni is working at this clothing store once again. And so that was the follow-up to that segment. And there will be at least one more segment that shows Leni working at the clothing store. And actually, and I bring that up because that other segment that's going to show Leni working at the clothing store actually features the return of a character who debuted in this segment, Fiona. Yes, Fiona first appears in this segment, and Fiona does return in a later segment. Fiona actually, yes, in this later segment, Fiona is shown to be a friend of Leni's. So we can, yeah, it seems safe to say that Leni and Fiona probably became friends because they're fellow employees at this clothing store. And some fans did note how it was rather interesting that Leni and Fiona are friends, because Leni is shown to be a fairly nice individual overall. Or yes, Leni is shown to be relatively nice when compared to other characters, although Leni still has her beware the nice ones moments. While Fiona, on the other hand, is shown to be rather irritable. Although, yes, in fairness, Fiona's irritability in this segment was pretty understandable, since Lincoln and Clyde did end up causing some messes and trouble within the clothing store. Although Lincoln and Clyde didn't mean any ill will by it, it was just unfortunate accidents that happened. Although, in this later segment, when Fiona returns, she is still shown to have an irritable nature to her. So yes, while Fiona's irritable nature makes sense within the context of this setting, a later entry does clarify that, yeah, Fiona in general has an irritable demeanor, and some fans do find that interesting that someone like Leni would be friends with someone like Fiona, considering those different dynamics. Although some fans have acknowledged in real life they are friends with people that have rather different personalities. And I can attest to that myself. I definitely know some people in real life that I would call my friends, but yeah, their personalities wouldn't really, their personalities would be quite different from my own personality, to say the least. So I can understand those, I can understand that, or I can buy into the idea of Leni and Fiona being friends, even though they have very different personalities. But yes, Fiona will return in a later segment, and we will get to see a little bit more of Fiona's character. But yes, some fans did think that it was nice that we do get to meet a friend of Leni's who seems to be pretty much Leni's friend. I had mentioned before that there were some fellow high schoolers that seemed to be friends with both Lori and Leni, like Becky, for example. But in this segment, Fiona is really shown to be more so Leni's friend. Fiona isn't really shown to interact with Lori in this later entry. Who knows if that'll change in Season 4 or Season 5, but so far, as of the recording of this video, Fiona really seems to just interact with Leni or be Leni's friend. And, while I'm on the topic about Fiona, yes, while I'm on the topic of Fiona acting rather irritable towards Lincoln and Clyde, I do remember some fan works actually went along with the idea that Fiona wouldn't be on pleasant terms with Lincoln and Clyde. Or, yes, I've seen some fan works that rolled with that idea of Fiona not really having... I have seen some fan works go with that idea of Fiona not having warm feelings towards Lincoln or Clyde because of the complications that they caused at the clothing store. Some fan works really ran with that idea of Fiona not seeing Lincoln and Clyde in a very good light. So that was something I noticed. Yeah, this was Fiona's debut, but she quickly became prevalent in some fan works, particularly fan works that do like to consider Fiona to be an antagonist towards Lincoln and Clyde. And otherwise, besides Fiona, this segment, while Fiona debuts in this segment was also the return for Mrs. Carmichael, who first appeared in Shop Girl. And here we get to see a little bit more about Mrs. Carmichael's personality, and we do get to learn a little bit more about her family, even if it's only brief. Or yes, it's only a little information, but still important information all the same. We find out that Mrs. Carmichael has a son, and her son is younger than Lincoln and Clyde, although his name is actually never revealed in this segment. Now, I don't believe Mrs. Carmichael's son returns in a later entry in Season 3, at least from what I recall. I'll have to refresh my memory when I rewatch the later entries of Season 3 for those entries' recap and thoughts videos. But from what I recall, I don't believe Mrs. Carmichael's son returns in Season 3. Maybe he'll show up again in Season 4, or maybe Season 5 too. I'm not entirely sure, but maybe he can return, and maybe we can learn his name and learn a little bit more about him. But yeah, it was nice to learn a little bit about Mrs. Carmichael's family. We find out that she has a son at least. And Mrs. Carmichael, here in this segment, Mrs. Carmichael is shown to be a rather reasonable authority figure. Yes, some fans did like how Mrs. Carmichael was a rather reasonable authority figure. Mrs. Carmichael, while Mrs. Carmichael was wrong about Leni being the one who stole the scarves, fans did acknowledge that it wasn't hard to understand why Mrs. Carmichael would come to the conclusion that she did about Leni stealing the scarves. And Mrs. Carmichael was willing to admit when she was wrong, and she did make a point to apologize to Leni after Leni's name was cleared. And so some fans definitely appreciated that about Mrs. Carmichael. They could understand why Mrs. Carmichael came to those conclusions, and they also appreciated that she had the good grace to admit that she was wrong and to apologize for Leni after Leni's name was cleared. And some fans also did appreciate how Mrs. Carmichael did appreciate what Lincoln and Clyde were trying to do to help clear Leni's name. Yes, Mrs. Carmichael did acknowledge, while Mrs. Carmichael did acknowledge that Lincoln and Clyde were causing trouble at the clothing store, and, some fans did acknowledge that Mrs. Carmichael had a point about Lincoln and Clyde causing trouble at the clothing store, even though they had good intentions. And fans did appreciate that Mrs. Carmichael acknowledged that Lincoln and Clyde had their hearts in the right place, and they meant well. They honestly were trying to help Leni out, clear Leni's name. And Mrs. Carmichael actually appreciated and even respected that Lincoln and Clyde were trying to clear Leni's name. Some fans felt that Mrs. Carmichael... Yes, that definitely helped to present Mrs. Carmichael in a positive light for many fans. Fans could see where Mrs. Carmichael was coming from with regards to thinking Leni was the culprit and not wanting Lincoln and Clyde to be around the clothing store, but they also did appreciate that Mrs. Carmichael was willing to admit when she was wrong, and that she was willing to acknowledge that Lincoln and Clyde had good intentions and that they weren't trying to cause trouble at the store. They were just trying to help Leni out. And yeah, there was probably only one instance where fans thought that Mrs. Carmichael didn't act like a reasonable authority figure, and that was when Mrs. Carmichael had threatened to see to it that they would be banned from the mall until they were 18 years old. Now, yeah, some fans could understand Mrs. Carmichael being annoyed if Lincoln and Clyde were just leading her on a wild goose chase because they jumped to conclusions. But at the same time, some fans thought banning Lincoln and Clyde from the entire mall over some misunderstanding seemed like disproportionate retribution. And some fans even wondered how Mrs. Carmichael would be able to convince the entire mall to keep Lincoln and Clyde out of the entire mall. Although some fans had also suspected maybe Mrs. Carmichael was just saying that in order to make sure that Lincoln and Clyde wouldn't cause any more disturbances. Yeah, some fans wondered if maybe Mrs. Carmichael was just saying that exaggerated threat in order to get Lincoln and Clyde to make sure that they weren't wasting her time. So, yeah, that was probably the one instance where fans thought Mrs. Carmichael seemed some fans thought that was the one instance of Mrs. Carmichael not acting like a reasonable authority figure. But fans did appreciate that she was otherwise a reasonable authority figure. And while we're on the topic of Mrs. Carmichael, her son, yes, while Mrs. Carmichael was pretty much presented in a sympathetic light, even though she ended up being wrong about Leni being the one who took the scarves, Mrs. Carmichael's son was also presented in a sympathetic light. While Mrs. Carmichael's son was the one who took the scarves, it's made very clear to us that he really had no ill will. Like, Mrs. Carmichael's son wasn't trying to take the scarves to get back at his mom for being too busy to play with him or anything like that. He wasn't trying to be malicious. He just wanted to play superheroes, and Mrs. Carmichael's son just didn't seem to realize that taking the scarves was causing some problems. Yes, it was more like, yeah, Mrs. Carmichael's son wasn't a bad kid by any means. He just was an unwilling instigator of doom, or a very downplayed example of an unwilling instigator of doom, since this was a pretty mundane situation compared to more dramatic versions that you see in other works of fiction. But yeah, bottom line was Mrs. Carmichael's son was the culprit, but he was presented in a sympathetic light. He wasn't shown to be a bad kid who was trying to misbehave. He just didn't realize that him taking the scarves for his superhero games ended up causing some trouble. And yeah, some fans also did appreciate how, some fans also thought it was pretty heartwarming to see Mrs. Carmichael's son thinking that Lincoln and Clyde were really cool with their superhero costumes. Some fans thought that was pretty heartwarming. And speaking of heartwarming moments relating to Ace Savvy, fans did appreciate how Leni was grateful for Lincoln and Clyde clearing her name, and how Leni was actually telling other people at the mall about how Lincoln and Clyde were great detectives. Some fans really liked this in light of the Season 1 segment, Sleuth or Consequences, because Leni was one of the Loud sisters that joined in on teasing Lincoln over his interest in Ace Savvy. So fans did appreciate that Leni actually seemed to have more of an appreciation for Ace Savvy in this segment, and was actually calling Lincoln and Clyde great detectives, and suggesting that others in the mall should enlist Lincoln and Clyde's detective talents. Now, some fans have also pointed out that Pulp Friction, the Season 2 segment, showed the Loud sisters viewing the Ace Savvy franchise in a better light compared to Sleuth or Consequences. Although some fans had wondered if that might have been more because the Loud sisters were the inspiration for the Full House gang, and so some fans did wonder how sincere that was. But here, some fans definitely felt that Leni's appreciation for Lincoln and Clyde's help and her spreading the word of their detective skills seemed more sincere to some fans' eyes. So yeah, some fans definitely thought that this was a heartwarming segment. And overall, I also did like how Lincoln and Clyde were presented in this segment. Lincoln and Clyde had good intentions. Any of the trouble that they did cause was not out of ill will. It was just unfortunate accidents that happened while they were trying to do the good deed of clearing Leni's name. Or they had good intentions about trying to clear Leni's name. It's just, unfortunately, some accidents happened while they tried to do so. And Lincoln and Clyde were willing to admit when they were wrong. They were willing to apologize to those that they accused of being suspects, and they were willing to. They were also willing to acknowledge that they need to learn from their past mistakes so that they don't repeat those mistakes in the future. So I thought that was a really good detail too. I felt that I felt like all the characters were all presented in an understandable light. I don't think anyone was really made out to be a bad guy in this segment, or no one was really made out to be, I think no one was really made out to be the bad guy in this segment. It was more cases where you could understand where characters were coming from, and some characters were still presented in a sympathetic light, even if they didn't make the best choices, and that was something I appreciated. So overall, yeah, I did enjoy this segment. So to quickly summarize, I liked how this segment continued on with the storyline about Leni now working at a clothing store at the mall. I did appreciate that we got to meet another employee at this clothing store, an employee who would go on to become one of Leni's friends, and we will get to see her, Fiona, in a more prevalent role in a later entry of Season 3. It was nice to see more of Mrs. Carmichael. It was nice to see Mrs. Carmichael return. We got to learn about some of her family. We got to learn a little bit more about her personality. And it was nice to see that Mrs. Carmichael was a reasonable authority figure for the most part. And Mrs. Carmichael's son was also a likable character. A kid who enjoyed superheroes, but who ended up causing trouble, but not on purpose. He just didn't realize the full extent of his actions. And like I said, it was nice that Lincoln and Clyde wanted to help Leni out, and they did acknowledge their mistakes. They were willing to acknowledge their mistakes, but it was also very clear that they had their hearts in the right place. And it was heartwarming that Leni really appreciated Lincoln and Clyde's detective talents. So yes, I would definitely say I favor this segment over its sibling segment. Oh, and while I'm thinking about it, some fans have pointed out how justice was in the title for this segment's sibling segment, while crime was in the title for this segment. So some fans thought that was pretty cool theme naming between the segments for this episode, episode 66. I don't know if that was intentional or coincidence on the staff or crew member's part, but it ended up working out as theme naming between the two segments for this episode, and that was pretty cool. So otherwise, yeah, I would say that's it for now. So as of this video, we've now discussed the B segment for episode 66 of The Loud House on this channel. Take care, and until next time.